Only one Toronto newscast can prepare you for the future. Hillary Brown and the CBC at 6. News for the 90s.
The Disability Network is pre-recorded. That is why the program you are about to see does not carry a reaction to the execution Friday of Dalton Prejean in Louisiana. Prejean, whom we interviewed last week, had the mental age of 13.
You got a right to cry. I once was blind, but now I see.
Faith healing on Canada's very own religious television network. But not all people with disabilities like it. Hello and welcome to another edition of DNet, the Disability Network. I'm Joe Coughlin.
And I'm Susan Pettit. Should people with disabilities laugh, cry, or take seriously the age-old claims of faith healers? We asked that question because of a program that is appearing across Canada on Vision TV.
Vision went on the air across Canada over a year ago, promising to be different from the hard-sell Christian broadcasting stations in the United States. Vision offers cable subscribers a wide variety of programs. One of them is Victory, a California-based series hosted by a man who promises to cure people of their disabilities.
Turn around and look at me again. Look at how that eye is just so perfect. Who did this for you?
Jesus. My precious Jesus did it for me. How I praise him and I glorify him and I give you praise and glory.
Hold it tight, Paul. Put your hand on the other hand on the back of her head. That's right. Look at me. You got a right to cry. I once was blind, but now I see. You got a right to cry. Look at those tears coming out of those eyes. Do this. Can you step aside just a half a second? Do this. Do this. Do this. Do this.
Morris Chirillo operates out of California. He has a post office box number in Canada for Canadian viewers who want to buy his faith-healing tapes. Like countless faith healers through the ages, he promises to heal persons with disabilities.
If you have legs that you cannot move, you say to me, Brother Strollo, do you actually believe that God could heal my crippled legs? I've seen cripples come out of wheelchairs by the hundreds. In 42 years of ministry in the nations of the world, not one, but hundreds. If you have blind eyes, put your hand on those blind eyes. If you have deaf ears, if you have hearing aids, just take them out and put your fingers where those hearing aids were and where your deaf ears are.
Earlier, Susan spoke with disabled activists Mike McHenry and Beryl Potter.
Mr. McHenry, what do you think of this kind of program?
This type of show is simply a mistake. It's taking us back into the dark ages in terms of images portrayed of disabled people as passive recipients of healing and passive recipients of a benevolent God. I don't think disabled people have anything to be ashamed of, and this type of program would lead us to feel that we're cursed in some way. That's the wrong message.
Mrs. Potter, what about you?
Well, I get very upset because I know a lot of people are being hurt very badly over this. Persons with disabilities are very vulnerable to this type of program. We've had a lot of cases, but one young lady who was told actually to give everything away and she would receive a healing. We found her in the middle of her living room, almost starved to death. She'd given all her furniture away, her food, and even her wheelchair, and thrown her medication away.
Mr. McHenry, do you have any examples like this?
Well, as a God-fearing atheist, I can only think of myself in a certain way, having 3 disabilities. I don't know which denomination to go to, which fundamentalist church to hit, so I think I'll stay the way I am and try to push for improvements in the employment area and human rights and the end of discrimination for people with disabilities, rather than turning to a power I don't necessarily take much stock in.
Well, have you ever been tempted, either one of you, to turn to this?
Well, I've had people come up and ask me, you know, if you have so much faith. I do have a lot of faith, Sue. But I've been asked, if you have so much faith, I'm going to measure your arm to see if it's going to grow every day. And they've actually come up with a tape measure and wanted to take measurements of my arm every day to see if the stump was growing. We don't need this type of patronization. I don't need people patting me on the head and saying, you poor dear. The healing, yes, I believe. But my healing comes from within. It's what I believe. And I believe that my healing has come with accepting what has happened, and we are a human being.
So how do both of you feel about this kind of programming on Canadian television?
I think it's very patronizing, and I think they're exploiting.
Let's
Mr.
talk about the
McKenzie.
real issues.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As we said, that interview was recorded earlier. We invited officials of Vision TV to take part in today's program. They declined. Susan, because of your disability, have you had any experiences with faith healing or things like that?
Well, actually, as a little girl, I looked for answers and wanted to seek other alternatives, and did a lot of reading of Edgar Cayce, and looked into mediums, the Akashic files and past lives, and yeah, I would say, you know, I looked to religion, but not certainly with TV evangelism. What about you, Joe?
Well, as a Catholic, there was a lot of people in my church that were pressuring my mom and dad to start fundraising efforts to send me to Lourdes, Fatima, and then I think late as I was a teenager, there was a Filipino faith healer in the Philippines that they wanted me to go see, but I had other things to do, I guess.
Wow.
Yeah. You're watching the Disability Network. DNet will be right back.
I was raped over and over again from the time I was 4 till I was 11. Unlike the other kids, I couldn't run away from him. So I was sexually abused because I was disabled, mobility impaired, but I got more disabled because of what he did to me.
That's a quote from one of many disabled persons who've been subjected to abuse. Earlier this week, another story caught our attention. In Kitchener, Ontario, an ice cream vendor was convicted of sexually assaulting a 13-year-old girl who has a developmental disability. People with disabilities are often subjected to violence, partly because of their dependence on other people, partly because of their apparent defenselessness. A study has shown that people with disabilities are 2 to 10 times as likely to be victims of abuse as the general population.
This week in Toronto, there was a symposium that looked at the subject of abuse and persons with disabilities. Joining me now are two of the people who took part in the symposium. Richard Sopsey is a professor at the University of Alberta. He's the author of the study about the abuse of people with disabilities. Pierre Hebert is the director of the Disabled Victims of Violence program in Ottawa. He was sexually assaulted by a care provider. Mr. Hebert, what happened in this situation?
It was during a bath. When a person came to give me a bath, it was during the bath that I was sexually assaulted by the person came to me.
What did you do at that particular point?
Well, the start that I didn't tell anybody until the next day, when I, in time, told what had happened.
Who did you tell?
And then the care attendant.
Mm-hmm. What happened as a result of you talking about your experience and reporting your experience?
Well, I lost my services over it.
You lost your services?
Yeah.
Mr. Sopsey, is this a common story?
It's a much too common story, really. Many women and men with disabilities and children with disabilities are sexually assaulted or sexually abused. And unfortunately, some of the other aspects, such as loss of service, also are fairly common. And unfortunately, often it's a caregiver who is committing the abuse.
Why are people with disabilities targets for this type of abuse?
Well, they're often targets just for the reason Pierre talks about. They're perceived as vulnerable by their caregivers. They may have communication difficulties. Our very educational system, sometimes rather than training them to exercise choices, trains them to be compliant, and that makes for good victims. And sometimes just by being brought into an institutional setting or into a situation in which they come in contact with many caregivers, it increases the risk.
How do the authorities react to situations like this, namely the police and maybe some other people in authoritative positions?
Well, we're seeing a real increase in police actively wanting to pursue these cases and treating them like any other case of sexual assault or sexual abuse. In some cases, there still is a reluctance on the part of the police and the courts to pursue these cases. In some cases, they feel that if it's an institutional setting or a social service setting, in a sense, it should be regulated almost by some other agency. In some cases, they may feel uncomfortable or not know how to deal with the victim because of the disability, and there may be a reluctance in some cases for that reason.
Now, if there are viewers of ours out there that are in a situation where they're being sexually assaulted or abused in any other fashion, in the home or in an institutional setting, what should they do?
Well, it's very important that abuse gets reported. If it's not reported, likely that same caregiver will abuse them again in the future. Additionally, that caregiver may abuse many other individuals with disabilities who they come in contact with. Now, I would also say, while it's important that the report is made, it's also important for people to be in touch with victims advocacy groups such as Victims of Violence that Pierre Ribert works with, because they really represent the independent interests of the victim, and they can advise the person really on the basis of protecting them, and that's an important thing to do.
Mr. Ribert, what types of advice would you give people in that situation?
Well, okay, first of all, I would try to contact people close to them and get advice from them. It's really difficult. You know, I was afraid to go to the people that are close to you and then seek out their advice. And if you can, try to move or try to set up alternative care systems if you are planning to report. That way, if something does happen, you'll have backup.
Mr. Ribert, Mr. Sopsey, thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's mailbag time again on DNet. Before we start, I again urge you to tell us what you think of the program and the stories we are doing. Some think we are coming on too strong. Others say we're not strong enough. Among those viewers who like what we are doing are Mary Louise and Tom Hayes of Tecumseh, Ontario.
We wish to congratulate you on the superb job you are doing on your Saturday program. It is informative and interesting. We especially appreciate the way you conduct your interviews. When you ask a guest a question, you let him or her answer, unlike some programs where the interviewers try to put their own personal views in their guests' mouths.
In another letter from Ottawa, Niji Vig would like us to look at the fact that the transport services for disabled persons in Ottawa are not available to persons who are blind or visually impaired. Neither, as far as we know, are similar services in other cities.
I would like you to discuss this issue with blind people. I am very interested to know how other blind people feel about not being allowed to use paratransport. Only a very few courageous blind people manage to use the public bus frequently.
George A. Buchanan of Weston, Ontario, does not like the fact that people with disabilities are rarely seen on television and other media.
We never see any persons in a commercial who are disabled. Also, you never see disabled persons in any store advertisements. Keep up the good work you are doing for disabled persons.
As some of you know, I have an invisible disability, cystic fibrosis. Jennifer Ann Eastham of Ottawa also has an invisible disability, and she feels that not enough people know that such a category exists.
I am one of the many individuals that is suffering from a learning disability. I thank God that I have the Ottawa chapter of the Learning Disabilities Association, because they help me with my frustrations that I feel inside, and they are a lifeline. I am one of a few that has accomplished their dreams of going to college, and I am not going to forget my fellow students with the same dreams and goals.
Joe, before we give our address, I'd like to share a personal story with our viewers that shows just how many people have never heard the term invisible disability. I pulled into a disabled parking space with my friend, and a police officer came around to the car and looked inside when I wound the window down, and he looked at our legs and said, you know, I'm waiting to see when you get out of this car which one of you can't walk. And it was very clear that he wasn't aware that these permits are issued to people with invisible disabilities, such as breathing and heart conditions. And, you know, we need to educate our public a little more.
It's obvious that even the police force could use some education around these matters.
That's right.
If you'd like to write us with your comments, here's our address. The Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station 8, Toronto, M5W1E6. And our fax number is area code 416-975-5636. That's Pearson International Airport, the gateway to Toronto. This is the border of metropolitan Toronto. On the other side of the line is the city of Mississauga. Back to metropolitan Toronto. Wheel-Trans, the metro bus service for people with disabilities, will bring you as far as this point for $1.20. If you want Wheel-Trans to bring you to the airport, it will cost you an extra $38.80. That's right, $38.80. That's because the minimum charge from anywhere in Metro Toronto to the airport is $40, unless there is more than one passenger. Then the charge is $20 per passenger. Wheel-Trans calls this its special service to the airport. The regular coach service from downtown Toronto costs $8.75. It runs every 20 minutes. Wheel-Trans special service must be booked 4 days in advance. $1.20, $40. $1.20, $40. Last fall in Toronto, Barbara McDougall, the Minister of Employment and Immigration, announced a major employment project for the disabled that, among other things, led to the creation of this television program.
I'm particularly pleased to confirm federal funding under Employment and Immigration Canada's Innovations Program of $2 million.
The Access Connections project has two parts: the Media Connection, which is co-producing the Disability Network with CBC, and the Employment Connection, a job placement agency tailored for people with disabilities. Two key players in the project, in addition to the federal government, are Metro Toronto and the Centre for Independent Living in Toronto, CILT. The Employment Connection side of the project is just open for business. Susan has prepared this special report.
Mike Yale was 5 years old when he lost his sight in an explosion and fire. Like most people with disabilities in Canada, he knows what it's like to be disabled. So has Sue Clifford McHenry, who has spina bifida. She has experienced both unemployment and underemployment. Her colleague, Roy Jones, who is legally blind, also knows what it's like to collect unemployment insurance. Jones and Clifford McHenry now work as employment specialists with Access Connections. It's an innovative employment service for the disabled that was launched the other day in Toronto. The project, which includes a media production service, is controlled by people with disabilities. Its executive director is Mike Yale.
So we are not only an employment agency that will seek to help persons with disabilities find employment, and will also do a considerable amount of outreach to the employer community, both government and private sector, but we are also a model employer, employing persons with disabilities, providing the kinds of accommodations, many of which cost very little, which make it more possible, more efficient for persons with disabilities to be employed.
Yale, a well-known disability rights activist, says we can expect to see the agency bring fresh attitudes to the area of employment.
Disabled people making decisions that affect their lives, disabled people integrated fully into their communities, and disabled people working at productive employment, not marginal, not repetitive, stereotyped employment as in the past, but gainful, productive employment with, top employers in the metro area.
Karen Ann Glenn, who has an invisible disability, is the project's employment director. She says she and her colleagues will be going after quality jobs. The types of jobs people get are more important than the number of people placed in the jobs.
Because we could place a number of people in entry-level, short-term contract jobs, and at the end of the year say, we made 500 job placements, when in fact, that isn't what we're trying to do. We'd rather make 100 meaningful placements where people's skills are truly utilized. For example, on the radio show last week, a young man called in, a caller, to express his outrage. He's a qualified elementary school teacher who graduated with good marks, good reports, and has never been hired, has never been successful in being hired in a year and a half with any of the school boards. We believe it's because of their fear of his blindness, because the kinds of questions that he's asked are, well, how will he supervise the children, and questions such as that. And it's a shame. That's exactly the kind of situation we're talking about, where you have a qualified professional person with real skills who isn't able to utilize their skills, probably because of the systemic barrier of fear.
Vic Willey, Executive Director of the Centre for Independent Living in Toronto, helped found Access Connections. He says Access Connections reflects the philosophy of the independent living movement.
The independent living movement is all about people being empowered, people taking control and responsibility, and people taking risks. People with disabilities have, for far too long, been prevented from taking risks, and that is an essence of humanity, to be able to take risks and to do new things in your own life and to take control of your own life. And that really is what this program is about. Most of the staff on Access Connections are people with disabilities, long experience with employment equity, very highly qualified, and we will be working with employers saying, hey, we have someone here for you to hire. This person has qualifications, the qualifications you are looking for. And by the way, they have brown hair and they have a disability. And that is going to be our approach.
Access Connections is now open for business at its spacious and comfortable offices in Toronto. If you want to contact one of the employment specialists, the number is 921-5592. That's 921-5592.
As we said, the Disability Network is a component of Access Connections. And just this week, we managed to make the news in a way that we didn't expect.
I'm Beth Harrington. Last night, CBC's new Disability Network was presented with a special award for its work, but receiving the award was easier said than done. They were supposed to receive the award at Ryerson's Theatre, but there was one glaring error. When the team from the Disability Network arrived, they found out the building was not accessible by wheelchair. They decided to move the presentation outside so everyone could attend. Lieutenant Governor Lincoln Alexander then presented the award.
I want to thank you for the dedication, commitment, and hard work and all that you've done that would allow your peers and those who would judge you in terms of allowing you to have this wonderful award.
You know, Susan, I don't know how many times I've had to walk in through the back entrances or around the garbage to get into a place, and I think this time was just one time too many.
Well, Joe, you know, it's a slow process, but I think people are becoming educated. We'll be right back with the award-winning DNet.
Before we go, we want to thank the Alliance of Canadian Television and Radio Artists, Actra, for this First Into the Mainstream award.
The award, which was presented to us by Ontario Lieutenant Governor Lincoln Alexander, is yet another sign that the media is starting to pay long overdue attention to the views of people with disabilities. I'm Susan Pettit.
And I'm Joe Coughlin.
I think this conference, which you've held, is of prime importance because there's no question about it. I know the problem. We haven't recognized the visible minorities, we haven't recognized the audible minorities or the disabled. I want to thank you for the dedication, commitment, and hard work and all that you've done that would allow your peers and those who would judge you in terms of allowing you to have this wonderful award. I wish you continued success. I'm delighted to be here as Her Majesty's representative and for the province of Ontario to extend to each and every one of you sincerest greetings. Keep up the good work, and may you continue to be inspired, and may God watch over and bless all of you, and don't lose patience. We've come a long way, but we've got a heck of a long way to go. Keep up.
When the clock strikes 11, only one newscast can give you the real picture. Ona Fletcher, weeknights on the CBC at 11, News for the 90s.